For this video, I'm going to be talking a little bit about a paper that I wrote last semester for my Latin class. The class was about the author Prudentius, mainly focusing on his work, the Psychomachia. And I'm just going to kind of summarize what I talked about in that paper and probably not get too much into the details of the different Latin phrases, but I might here and there. So without further ado, I'm going to pull up some other information and we'll start talking. All right, so my paper, like I said, was about Prudentius's Psychomachia. So this poem was the first entirely metaphorical poem in Latin. The main metaphor used is that of a battle, describing interaction between vices and virtues in someone's soul. This makes sense to be portrayed as a battle. I think we can agree on that. These are two opposite forces contending for mastery over someone or the way that someone lives. So a sentence that I put at the beginning of my paper is, in this poem, Prudentius uses the martial environment and the placement of the virtues in that environment to demonstrate the purpose of the virtues and to explain connections among the individual virtues in order to give insights into the Christian life. Before we move into certain details, I should give an overview of my objective with this paper. So during the entire of the battle metaphor, it never lays out a specific overall battle plan. It just goes into individual fights between a pair of a virtue and a vice, and the poem breaks down each individual battle. So I was trying to see if I could derive or deduce a better picture of the battlefield overall and kind of any formation that was being used by the army of the virtues, and specifically was the one that I was focused on for this paper. So the first thing to note about the army of the virtues is that they were an invading army, and that means they are trying to occupy the soul, which is already controlled or taken over by the vices. So this is an army that is marching to kind of relieve the soul from the oppression of the vices. I know that the army of the virtues is involved in an offensive campaign because of a few factors. First of all, the camp, the way it is described in the poem, matches not with a defensive camp defending a border or a Roman frontier, such as many of the fortifications that were around during Prudentius's lifetime, but instead he chooses to describe the camp of the virtues as one that could be used by an army on the march. Often the Roman armies, when they were marching through hostile territory, they would build a camp that was fortified at the end of each day's march, and the camp in the poem has many of the same features as such camps, and this gives us a clue as to the purpose and situation that the army of the virtues is in when they're making this camp. Additionally, the vices have modified the battlefield before the battle begins, and you cannot do that unless you already live in the area or at least occupy the area where the battle will take place. But at the same time, they were not all assembled at the beginning of the battle. So this indicates that if the vices had been the initiators of the battle and the ones who were attacking or invading, they probably would have collected their entire force before making a move, whereas the virtues are all present from the start of the battle, indicating that the virtues are the aggressors in this contest for the soul. Before we move on, I'll mention a few other fun facts about the poem. First of all, the characters are all feminine or female characters because in Latin, abstract nouns being derived from other verbs or other nouns. All the abstract nouns are actually feminine in almost all cases. So using a metaphor, which involves personification of different ideas, specifically here the vices and the virtues, just by the nature of the Latin language, those nouns are all going to be feminine nouns. So it makes sense to also describe them as female characters in the poem. So that is one note to make. All right, so this is how I then figured out the orientation of the battlefield. So most of this is coming from the specific details of the battle between luxury and sobriety. But before we get into that, I will mention the basic layout of the battlefield seems to just be a grassy field, or gramenus campus in Latin. So that's just the baseline that seems to be established. It's not said that all of the battles take place in a grassy field, but the description of certain elements of the poem make it seem that while there are some other features, almost all of the default situation is just the grassy field, which makes sense because many ancient battles did take place in these kind of open spaces. So how do we arrive then at the picture that I've placed before you? So this is one possible orientation of the battlefield. So I've drawn up the virtues battle line on a west to east kind of orientation, and that is because of some factors describing how luxury arrived at the battlefield. I mentioned a minute ago that not all of the vices were ready when the battle started, and luxury, well, she was the main person who was not ready. So she had to kind of make a hasty approach to the battlefield after the battle had already begun. She does have a chariot, which allows her to move more quickly. And it also says in the text that she arrived on the right flank of the battle and that she came from the west. So you see that's how I've deduced the overall orientation. Also, in the course of her battle, her chariot is overturned and defeated as sobriety makes a stand to kind of rally the right flank, which was faltering under luxury's influence. And part of the reason that the chariot is overthrown is because it runs across this rough terrain here. So that includes rocky areas, thickets, things of that nature. And also some of luxury's accompanying members of her force are said to be retreating through rough terrain. So that leads me to know that there had to be rough terrain near to the right flank, but it couldn't be in the way of the path of the chariot initially. Otherwise, the chariot would have never approached in that direction. And it still needs to be close enough, though, that during the fight, it can still be involved. So this is one option if luxury arrives from the west onto the right flank, kind of in a almost flanking attack. Another option is that luxury kind of came head on toward the right flank, which would put the rough terrain on the north side of the battlefield. I personally feel like this makes a little more sense because it would mean there's some kind of natural geographic feature that's defining the edge of the battlefield. Again, kind of the end of that grassy plain that the virtues and vices have drawn up their forces along. So that gives us the orientation of the battle, but using some of the other information from some of the other individual fights and contests between vices and virtues, we can add to this picture. So, going back to the first option for the orientation, we could picture the battle line of the virtues as shown before you. So sobriety, we have already said, faces off luxury on the right. That is clearly said in the poem. These other forces are not clearly stated where they are along the virtues battle line. So we'll start with talking about humility, which I've placed on the left in my illustration. So during the battle with humility, she faces off against pride. Pride is on horseback, mounted, and humility looks to be so lowly to pride that she just charges straight at them, thinking she will run them over. Humility has little armor, very little equipment, is inexperienced in battle, it's said in the poem, and pride decides that she can just charge them down and run them over. But there is a trench unbeknownst to pride, and she falls into it before she even reaches humility. As the poem says, sed cadet in foeam praecaps, falls headlong into a ditch. And this trench was the modification of the battlefield that I mentioned earlier. So Deceit, which is another member of the army of the Vices, was able to create this trench kind of as another defense or trap, hopefully to stop the advancing army of the Virtues. But Deceit apparently did not share this information very well with the rest of their army, because Pride falls into this trench and is ultimately defeated by Humility because of that. And I believe that it makes sense to place Humility and the trench on the left for a couple reasons. First of all, the trench is not mentioned in any of the other battles or any of the other individual fights during the battle. And it seems like if it was in the center, there would probably be more interaction with it. Also, it seems to make sense that if you had the rough terrain on one part of the battlefield, and then maybe you would make the trench on the other side to kind of delineate the field. Also, Humility makes sense to be placed on the left. Traditionally, the weakest part of the army, going back to ancient Greek practice, would be the left, would be the weakest part of the army. And Humility is definitely shown to be that in the poem. So that explains why Humility, I would think, would be on the left. And then that leaves Prudence as the center. So Prudence is the only other of the virtues that's kind of depicted as being in the main battle line. There are a few other virtues that are depicted as playing roles in the overall battle. For example, Faith leads an initial charge by some of the virtues, and we don't know where that occurs along the battle line, but she does not really hold a position. So I've only shown here on the picture virtues that seem to be holding in the same position more or less for the entirety of the battle. So Prudence is in the center, and I've based this off of some of the description of Prudence's weapons and a comparison of Prudence with and the priests who are with Prudence and some of the Levites. They're compared to Levites of old, and this matches with some ideas in the Roman army at the time that Prudentius was alive, where there were certain formations or legions or squadrons that dated back to earlier periods in Roman history, and these were often better equipped and more prestigious, and this matches with the description of Prudence. They're not the most elite soldiers, but they are kind of a notch above the average soldier. Furthermore, during the fight, Prudence and the forces accompanying Prudence, so she is leading a whole group, like I said, that leading the priests and Levites, and she's nearly overwhelmed in the center. Again, it doesn't say that she's in the center, but she is nearly overwhelmed, and Good Works leads some forces to her aid, and they're able to ultimately overturn the poor prospects of the battle that seem to be forming. And good works is said to be stepping up from the last rank, and this would fit perfectly with the idea of a reserve, which is a well-known tactic in military uh, command, that you would hold some of your forces in reserve to be able to either send them in for a finishing blow or be able to rescue the battle if things start turning against you. And this is the case with good works stepping in to lead or restore the prospects of the battle and kind of lead to the final conclusion of the battle. So I think it makes sense that since we know the reserve was behind prudence, so good works was behind prudence, and therefore if they are the reserve, it makes sense that the reserve would be in the center of the battlefield as well, because that way they would be close enough to aid in any area of the battlefield should it be necessary. So again, we'll look at the other possible layout of the formation. So here you see again, I have sobriety on the right, prudence in the center, humility on the left. But this is just switching the orientation if it was a north-south battle line, which was also an option based on what I had understood from the previous notes we've talked about. So this concludes the main portion of my paper in terms of determining the positioning and battle line of the different virtues. And we'll talk a little bit about some other things that I discovered that are not necessarily mappable, but we'll talk about a few conclusions that I also had in my paper. So that was most of what I was able to find out based on my initial premise of discovering the layout and the orientation of the battlefield and the formations used. So those virtues who I depicted in the battle line, each one of those virtues was said to be accompanied by a larger group of followers or soldiers. So they were kind of leading those groups. And the other virtues were harder to pin down. So the other virtues that were mentioned in the poem Psychomachia by Prudentius includes faith, which I mentioned already. Faith leads her forces and was able to defeat her opponent. Modesty is depicted as a lone kind of warrior who goes out and fights lust and manages to defeat her. And it's not really clear. There's not a clear connection between her and any of the other fights that take place in the battle. Patience, however, is very interesting. So she's depicted as a very heavily armored soldier, and she's able to defeat anger or wrath, who wastes her energy trying to break through all the armor and fails. Patience is also said to be going across the entire battlefield and aiding all the other virtues. And in this way, she seems to be, based on some of the descriptions of her armor, may also support this. It seems that she's being described almost in her movements and in her central role in the army as a cavalry unit. For those who don't know, in the late Roman army, cavalry was actually much more important for the Roman army, which was different from earlier eras of the Roman army. So she kind of in this way shows how she is an essential part of all the entire battle plan for all of the virtues. And she doesn't have one place where she stays, which makes sense for cavalry, which are much more fluid in their movements than other infantry type of soldiers. And then we also have one more leader, which is Concordia, which means unity in English, you could say. And she's kind of depicted not as taking place on the battlefield. She does defeat disunity. This is more after the battle and as they're going back toward the camp. And it seems to me that she is the lead strategist. So which makes sense. Unity holds the whole entire army of the virtues together, and this is also what the strategist does, kind of takes a big picture approach. And this kind of makes sense. So both she and faith are said to be the ones who are the most elevated of the virtues, the two in charge. So this makes sense to me that one would kind of be the field general, or the one leading from the front, the general in the thick of things, and the other is the strategist, and both are essential for the victory to happen. So in summary, we kind of have a series of virtues that are important for the overall depiction of the Christian life. So faith, unity, patience, right? These things that kind of are overarching themes. But we also see in the poem this idea that sobriety, prudence, and good works and humility are kind of the mainstays of the battle line that the virtues hold. So you could almost say they're kind of like the daily virtues, maybe. That was what I put forward in my paper as a possible conclusion we could draw from how Prudentius is understanding the virtues in the way that he depicts them. So I think that concludes everything more or less for my paper. So if you think this was interesting, you can let me know. If you thought it was boring, you can also let me know. We can talk about other things. I'll probably be doing things more directly related to Latin in some of these other Latin videos, but this kind of gives you a base for some of the places that I'm coming from, some of the things that I'm thinking about. So thanks for tuning in.